the Catholic Men's Podcast, helping you find good works of literature for the Catholic gentleman. Amazing Diving Stories by John Bantin. The Mystery of Commander Crabb. The story of a famous and heroic wartime diver who disappeared after the war in what seemed like very mysterious circumstances. Lionel Crabb, a pioneering Royal Navy frogman, received the George Cross in 1944 for his work removing Italian limpet mines from Allied merchant ships in Gibraltar Harbor. He remained in the Navy after the war, rising to the rank of commander, and was later said to have helped to inspire Ian Fleming's fictional British spy, James Bond. His activities certainly inspired the 1958 British movie, The Silent Enemy, starring Lawrence Harvey in the part of Crabb. After the war, Crabb continued to dive as a civilian. He explored the wreck of a Spanish galleon and investigated a suitable discharge site for a pipe from the atomic weapons station at Aldermaston. He later returned to the Royal Navy, and after helping rescue men trapped in a submarine, he was promoted to the rank of commander. He retired at the age of 55. It is claimed that in March 1956, Crabb received an urgent message to meet privately with Lord Mountbatten, the First Sea Lord. Crabb was told that he was needed for a secret mission, and that the results were to be shared with MI6 and the CIA. During the next few weeks, a CIA agent, Matthew Smith, spent a considerable time with Crabb. The mission involved spying on the Russian cruiser Ordzhonikidze, the ship that was going to bring Nikita Khrushchev and Nikolai Bulganin on a goodwill mission to Britain. There were details of the hull that the intelligence agencies were keen to know about. Some say Mountbatten warned Crabb that it was a dangerous mission. The Soviets had discovered earlier that there had been secret dives around the Sverdlov when that Russian cruiser visited England in 1955. On the 19th of April 1956, Crabb dived into Portsmouth Harbor, where the Ordzhonikidze was moored. He did not return, and it was assumed that he had been either captured or killed by the Russians. With the help of the intelligence services, the Admiralty attempted to cover up the attempt to spy on the Russian ship. On the 29th of April, the Admiralty announced that Crabb had gone missing after taking part in trials of underwater apparatus in Stokes Bay, 3 miles from Portsmouth. When later a body was found in Pagham Harbor and lifted from the water, the head fell off and disappeared. The hands were already gone. Only the old-fashioned Navy frogman drysuit permitted some sort of identification. The authorities stated it was the last remains of the missing frogman. However, the story of Commander Crabb wasn't allowed to die for the next 40 years, because nobody believed that he was really dead. The popular press turned his disappearance into an everlasting mystery story. Some thought he had been captured or defected and was living a life of luxury in Moscow. It was one of the most enduring mysteries of the Cold War, and if he were dead, who killed him? Later, Eduard Koltsov, a retired Russian frogman, claimed that he had cut the British diver's throat in Portsmouth Harbor when he caught him placing a mine on the hull of the ship that had brought Nikita Khrushchev and other Soviet leaders to Britain. According to a BBC News report at that time, Koltsov spoke to a Russian documentary team because he needed to tell the truth before his own death, but the claim was dismissed. It was unthinkable that the British government, or anyone working for it, would have deliberately endangered a visiting ship and all those on it in an English harbor. Mr. Koltsov was 23 at the time of the ship's visit and said that he was ordered to investigate suspicious activity around the ship when he spotted a diver fixing a mine to the hull. He showed the documentary team the dagger he claimed to use to kill the Englishman, and the Red Star medal that he was later secretly awarded for his bravery. "I saw a silhouette of a diver in a light frogman suit who was fiddling with something at the starboard side, next to the ship's ammunition stores," Mr. Koltzoff told the film crew, according to the BBC. "I swam closer and saw that he was fixing a mine." Journalist Yigal Serna later made this story less credible because of an investigation he made in Israel. He heard that an immigrant to his country in 1990 claimed he knew how Crabb had died. The man was Joseph Zverkin, a former head of Soviet naval intelligence. He had spent some time undercover as a spy in England during the 1950s. Serna was fascinated by the Crabb mystery. He arranged a meeting with Zverkin, who was suspicious about questions regarding Crabb, and refused at first to discuss the matter. Later, in a report sent to Britain's Diver magazine by Nick Fleming, Yigal Serna reveals what Zverkin finally told him. "Only at our third meeting did he tell me about Crabb," writes Fleming of Serna's interview with Zverkin. "He spoke in very precise, heavily accented English. He said that in 1956, when the event happened, he was in England under the code name of a German citizen." Zverkin's own words recount what happened. Quote, "Crabb was discovered by a watchman when he was seen swimming on the surface of the water next to the ship. An order was given to inspect the water, and 2 people on the deck were equipped with sniper guns, small caliber. One of them was an ordinary seaman, and the other an officer, the equivalent of a lieutenant, who was in charge of an artillery unit on the boat, and an exceptionally good shot. Crabb must have dived next to the boat and came up and swum on the surface. The lieutenant shot him in the head and killed him. He sank. All the stories about him being caught by us or that he was a Russian spy are not true." End quote. So it seems that the famous World War II diver, Commander Crabb, out of luck or out of practice with a pure oxygen rebreather used for covert operations, either suffered oxygen poisoning, a flood of his CCR unit, or simply lost control of his buoyancy or even his orientation, broke the surface, and was shot. He may have even raced for the surface, mortally injured after the Russian frogman's knife attack. If it's true, it makes an unromantic end to a long-running mystery. Story 2. The Black Hole of Andros. I remember the milkiness of the water, and that at 60 feet, we had been stopped by what looked like a weird mud floor, even though I was sure I had measured around 152 feet from the surface earlier. I touched the floor and received the shock of my life. There was no floor, nothing but warmth. I pulled my hand back so fast that my buddy took a tumble in the water. I had never experienced anything like it. I then buried my hand up to my elbow, then a leg, then submerged up to my waist, but still felt nothing. The quasi-floor had started moving in waves, like a bowl of jello. This was almost too much, but I had gone in up to my neck, and suddenly everything was as black as night. Was I free-falling? Had I come up under a ledge or what? I had inflated my BC to ascend, and when I popped out, my buddy had told me that the blackness flowed off my head like paint. It was spooky. This is what Dr. Steffi Schwab originally wrote of her encounter with the first chemical layer, diving into what was to become known as the Black Hole of Andros. It's unique. Among the many famous blue holes of the Bahamas, which are collapsed entrances to prehistoric cave systems, since flooded, when sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age, the Black Hole of Andros has intrigued the geologist, soft rock sedimentary petrologist, and geomicrobiologist. It was different. She and her husband, the most famous cave diver, Rob Palmer, had known about this black hole for years. They'd seen it from aerial photographs. At more than 100 feet across, it was big enough to be seen from space, but there was no way of getting there until much later after Rob's death in a leisure diving accident far away in Egypt, when Steffi found access to a small seaplane. That was because their targeted destination was in an area of the Bahamian outback on Andros. It was a place that no humans had ever visited, where the land surface was nothing but mud in places several meters deep. You couldn't walk or drive on it, and you certainly could not transport heavy diving equipment across it. Steffi must be credited as the first person to scuba dive in it. The question that intrigued the scientist in her was that whatever developed a black hole such as this was obviously tending to remain stable for very long periods of time, in parts possibly as long ago as 3.5 billion years. Yeah, right. But what lay beyond this black layer? She began to question the wisdom of attempting to pass down into it, but the scientist within her put her well-being to one side. I asked myself, would it matter? The answer was no. I only hoped that I would survive to tell someone about it. Sure enough, below this dark part, the water was crystal clear, and yet below it, another false floor. This was a purple to red color. It had a jelly-like appearance. She was diving in some stupendous chemical cocktail that might have looked as spectacular as anything that a Bahamian barman could concoct, only not quite as appetizing. It was certainly a unique environment, and once she had made it back to the surface, her intention was to return as soon as she could. However, access continued to be a problem, and she had to wait a long time for another opportunity. This came when the producer of an Australian film company that was traveling around the world filming unusual things underwater suggested to her that they came to the Bahamas to film a sequence around the famous blue holes. When she found out that their vessel came equipped with a Bell Ranger helicopter, she thought all her Christmases had come at once. She persuaded them to do a sequence filming the black hole as well. 2 other people went with her. They were Cheryl Main, who had expertise in the study of algae, which she thought would be useful, and David, a surveyor who surveyed the black hole. She had planned for 7 days of sampling. After filming in some of the famous blue holes, they took the helicopter and flew the 14 miles inland to get to the black hole. It was at this point that Steffi discovered she only had 2 days to complete her work because of the financial constraints associated with several helicopter journeys. Steffi decided to make camp at the black hole rather than be flown back and forth, even though the Bahamian sun was brutally hot and there was little in the way of shelter beyond what they could rudely construct. The area around the black hole was a nightmare of a swamp, with mangrove and poisonwood growing in the mush. Even the limestone border of the hole was a brittle honeycomb of rock that formed razor-sharp edges. It was a harsh environment above the hole, let alone in it, and she was intent on diving it again. Steffi had a hydrolab that could measure geochemical parameters such as dissolved oxygen, temperature, pH, salinity, and depth. She wanted to try to investigate the black layer before she dived into it. She hooked the lab up to her computer. She watched the data move across the screen and suddenly saw the dissolved oxygen level drop to nearly 0. Something was consuming the oxygen at that level. It was the level where she had measured the depth of the black layer last time. It probably contained a very high level of hydrogen sulfide, one of the most poisonous substances known to man. What she failed to notice was the temperature reading 99 degrees Fahrenheit, and the low pH reading that indicated an acid environment. Her curiosity was overwhelming. She prepared to dive and was soon passing down through that black layer. It was her second visit to this unique place. Scientific experiments were set up, samples taken for later analysis, and other nearby holes investigated too. Dr. Schwab's efforts have resulted in the recent knowledge that the water in black holes appears black because of the meter-thick microbial layer which lies at around 60 feet, dividing the oxic low salinity water at the top from denser anoxic saline water. Analysis of her purple samples revealed that they had discovered a novel species of bacteria. In October 2003, it was officially named Allochromatium palmeri after her late husband, Rob. He was the first person to describe the Andros enigma in his book, Deep into Blue Holes, and as he had tried for nearly 20 years to reach this site, Dr. Schwab and her research colleague, Dr. Rod Herbert at Dundee, agreed that Rob should receive that honor. Story 3. Close Call with a Humpback Whale. During his Navy diving days in 1971, Brett Gilliam had worked collecting data from fast-attack nuclear submarines. It was in the superb visibility afforded by the waters off the U.S. Virgin Islands. During the long underwater decompression stops required, he had often seen humpback whales. He became an enthusiastic humpback spotter, and this eventually led to 20 annual trips to the Silver Banks, an area between the Dominican Republic and Grand Turk. It's now an area well known among divers for encounters with humpback whales and their young calves. Standing on their tails and bobbing in the gentle evening sea, they positioned themselves with their heads turned to present eyes the size of hockey pucks that seemed to look right through you. At that point, the experience of swimming with our military subs seemed pretty pale in comparison. It was common to see pregnant females disappear and reappear a day or so later with a calf in tow, but nobody has ever recorded a mother whale giving birth. Where they go to and how the birth is accomplished is still one of life's big mysteries. It was February 1993. The weather was not too good and it was extremely windy. Diving out in the open ocean was out of the question, and, for want of anything better to do, Brett left the boat and went alone for a shallow dive in the lee of a coral reef, swimming among the coral pillars that punctuated the sandy bottom. Even here he could not escape the whales' presence, with their haunting songs flowing over and around the underwater landscape and filling his ears as he swam. He was very surprised indeed to round a coral head and come face to face with a mother whale and her calf. I was fewer than 10 feet from them, he recalled. What an opportunity for an underwater photographer. The whales were resting with the baby lying under its mother's watchful gaze. It was the smallest calf Brett had ever seen, at around 6 feet and 250 pounds. In fact, he remembered thinking it was about the same size and weight as him. My mind was racing. Was this a newborn calf? Had I nearly stumbled on what every photographer in the world had sought for decades? Certainly the calf was the right size, and clearly was so young that he couldn't hold his breath for more than a few seconds. I cradled my camera and began to line up the shots. Sure enough, the pair were waiting for me as I eased around the massive coral buttress into water that was now 15 feet deep. It was so surreal to see this Leviathan mother, some 50 feet in length, easing herself over the smooth, sandy bottom. Her massive pectoral fins gently grazed the sand, leaving a trench marking her trail, while the baby rode the pressure wave just above her head. The depth lessened even more, and her belly barely cleared the bottom. I moved to the coral head and clung to an outcrop to let them pass, all the while firing away with my wide angle. As the mother's 20-foot tail filled his lens from only inches away, Brett began a slow pursuit, but all the while wondering why there was no escort male supervising the pair. Maybe the rambunctious males were simply too cautious of the shallow water that might have stranded them. Brett was suddenly aware that the bottom was no longer 15 feet below him. His fin tips hit something solid when he kicked, and he looked down thinking he'd let himself drift onto the coral head. Wrong. The male I had been speculating about was directly below me, having been masked in the gloom before. He had now set his sights on moving up to place himself between his new family and me. He had accelerated his slow swim, and I now found him about to surface directly between my legs. To my left were the jagged coral branches of the reef top, and Mr. Big chose that moment to raise his pectoral fin to just clear the hazard. His fin soared over the coral head like a stunt airplane turning around a course pylon. That effectively killed any escape in that direction. A quick look behind confirmed that the whale's back would make contact with me in seconds. I gulped a breath and dove over his head with my chest massaging his widow's peak on the way by. Finning to give us each some space, I ended up about 3 feet off the bottom and under his right pectoral fin. Okay, this isn't so bad, I thought. He'll just glide over me, and then I can come up. Wrong again. He chose that exact moment to stop and simultaneously dropped his pectoral fin, neatly pinning me to the sand. I'd always wanted a close encounter, but this was ridiculous. There I was, flat on my back, with several tons of deadweight pectoral gently anchoring me. I never even thought of struggling. I lay quietly and played dead, rather aptly, I thought. From my constrained view, I could look the big guy in the eye from about 5 feet away. He articulated his gaze back to me and sized me up. After about 30 seconds, he eased up his pectoral fin and moved ahead. I put one hand up and fended myself off his belly as he moved over me at a snail's pace. Finally, the tail passed overhead and close enough to let me count the smallest barnacles. I gratefully hit the surface for some much-needed air. While I was taking an inventory of my own body parts and mentally calculating if I qualified for hypoxia-induced brain damage, all 3 whales came up at me from the shallows. The male led the mother and her baby deftly through the reef and then waited for them to exit to the deeper water. We regarded each other without malice as he ended up once again on the surface right next to me. I fired off a few frames, and then he moved gradually away into the blue with his charges. This concludes the 3 amazing diving stories by John Bantin. Thank you for listening, and Godspeed.